The river was restless that evening. Thick fog clung to the water's surface, shifting like ghostly fingers, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The sky, a deep indigo, carried the weight of an impending storm, the air thick with the scent of rain and something else, something old. Daniel Reeves tightened his coat around him, stepping carefully along the muddy riverbank. He hadn't planned to be out this late, but a wrong turn on the wooded trail had brought him here, to this forgotten stretch of land where the river bent unnaturally, carving a path through jagged rock. That's when he heard it, a desperate, panic splash, followed by a sharp, frantic whimper. Daniel's pulse quickened. His eyes darted to the water, but the fog was too thick. He took a step closer, heart pounding, ears straining against the eerie quiet. Then a bark, high-pitched, terrified. Something was in the river, something drowning. Without thinking, he lunged forward. The water was ice-cold, swallowing his breath as he waded in. His hands cut through the murky current, searching, grasping, until his fingers brushed against wet fur. A dog. Daniel wrapped his arms around the struggling animal, pulling it close, kicking against the pull of the river. The current fought him, claws of icy water dragging him deeper. But he pushed forward, gasping as he broke through the surface and stumbled onto the shore. The dog coughed, its small body trembling violently in his arms. Daniel held it close, smoothing wet fur away from its face. A golden retriever. Young, but not a puppy. A collar hung loosely around its neck, the tag too scratched to read. Daniel exhaled, his breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. "You're okay," he murmured. "I got you." The dog shivered against him, eyes wide, dark, too dark. A strange sensation crawled over Daniel's skin. Something about this felt wrong. The river, the fog, the stillness of the night. The fact that no one else was around. He looked back at the water, and his blood turned to ice. There, just beyond the surface, something was watching. Not an animal, not human, a shape. It didn't move, didn't ripple the water. It simply hovered beneath the surface, a shadow darker than the river itself. And then it blinked. Daniel stumbled backward, clutching the dog as a chill unlike anything he had ever known spread through his bones. When he looked again, the shadow was gone, but the feeling remained. Something had been there, and whatever it was watching them both. Daniel Reeves had never been the kind of man who believed in ghosts. Or, at least, that's what he told himself. Growing up in a small town nestled between thick forests and winding rivers, he had heard his share of eerie stories. The kind whispered around campfires, passed down by old men who swore they had seen things no one else believed. Shadows moving in places they shouldn't. Whispers on the wind when no one was there. But Daniel had always been a man of reason. Until the night his mother died. He had been 16 when it happened. A car accident on a rain-slicked road. She had been on her way home from work, the curve near the old bridge proving too sharp, too unforgiving. They had found her car crumpled against the guardrail. The impact should have killed her instantly. But it hadn't. She had survived the crash, long enough to crawl out, long enough to leave behind something that haunted Daniel to this day. The handprints. The paramedics found them smeared along the wet pavement, trailing toward the trees. Her palms, bloodied, desperate. But she hadn't made it far. Just a few feet from the wreckage, she had collapsed, died. The official cause was internal bleeding. But Daniel always wondered, because when they found her, her face had been twisted in terror, her wide, lifeless eyes staring into the woods. Like she had seen something no one else could. And ever since that night, Daniel had felt it too. That quiet, creeping sensation that someone was always just behind him, watching, waiting. It was why he had moved away, why he never visited the bridge, why he never went back to the river. Until tonight, until the dog. Daniel sat on his small couch, the retriever curled up beside him, still damp, still shaking. His apartment was modest. Bare walls, a few scattered books, an old record player collecting dust in the corner. He had never been one to fill a space with things. Memories were hard enough to carry. The dog shifted, resting its head on his knee. Daniel ran his fingers through its fur, still feeling the chill of the river on his skin. His eyes flickered to the scratched-up tag on its collar. No name, no address, just one thing faintly etched into the metal. A symbol, a spiral. His stomach tightened. He had seen that symbol before. A long time ago, the night his mother died. It had been on the guardrail, carved deep into the metal where her car had crashed. And now, here it was again, on this dog. Daniel's fingers trembled as he traced the marking, a cold dread settling into his bones. The dog's eyes met his. Dark, too dark. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt something stir in the pit of his stomach. Fear. The town of Black Hollow was small, the kind of place that didn't show up on most maps. Nestled deep in a valley, it was surrounded by thick, ancient forests and winding roads that seemed to go nowhere. It had always been quiet, too quiet, some would say, the kind of quiet that made the hairs on your neck stand on end, as if the land itself was listening. And then there was the river. The Black Hollow River had been there longer than anyone could remember, carving its way through the land like an old scar. It wasn't the kind of river people swam in, not even during the hottest summers. The water was always too cold, too dark, the current too strong. It had a way of taking things, pulling them under, never giving them back. And sometimes, when the fog rolled in just right, people swore they saw shapes beneath the surface. Shadows. Watching. Waiting. Daniel had heard the stories growing up. Everyone had. The drowning dog. The legend had been around for decades, passed down like a warning. People said that sometimes, late at night, a golden retriever would appear by the riverbank, soaking wet, shivering, whimpering for help. And if you heard it, if you followed it, you were never seen again. Some said the dog wasn't real, that it was a spirit, a trick played by something older than the town itself, something that lived in the river. Others swore it was a warning, that if you saw the dog and ignored it, something else would come for you. Daniel had never believed the stories. Until now. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and moss, laced with something metallic, something like blood. The trees along the banks leaned inward, their gnarled roots twisting like skeletal fingers reaching for the water. And the fog, it moved in slow, deliberate tendrils, curling along the ground, shifting like something alive. It muffled the sounds of the night, making the world feel smaller, trapped. Daniel stood at the edge of the river, the dog at his side, its fur still damp, its body pressed close to his leg. The water was still now, too still. No ripples, no movement, like the river was holding its breath. Then, from somewhere beyond the mist, a splash. Daniel's muscles tensed, his breath caught in his throat. And then, a voice, soft, distant, calling his name. The dog whimpered. Daniel turned toward the sound, his pulse hammering. He knew that voice. It was his mother's, calling to him from the river. The voice drifted through the mist, soft yet unmistakable. Daniel, it wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. But it was her voice, his mother's. Daniel's breath came in short, shallow gasps. He felt the cold seep deeper into his bones, the weight of the river pressing against him, even though he hadn't stepped forward. The golden retriever let out a low whimper, its body pressed firmly against his leg, ears pinned back. Something wasn't right. He swallowed hard, forcing his mind to catch up. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe the stress, the exhaustion, the memories, maybe it was all playing tricks on him. But then he heard it again. Daniel, help me. His knees nearly buckled, because it wasn't just a whisper in the wind. It wasn't a distant echo from the past. It was coming from the river, from beneath the water. Daniel's fingers curled into fists. Every logical part of his brain screamed at him to leave, to turn around and run. But another part, the part that had never gotten over the way his mother had died, the way she had crawled toward the trees in terror, the way her body had been found facing the river as if she had seen something there. That part of him refused to move. The dog let out another whimper, stepping away from the water's edge, but Daniel took a step closer. The fog swirled, parting just enough to reveal the river's surface. Black, still, empty, until it wasn't. A ripple broke the water. Then another. Something was rising. Daniel's breath hitched. His hands shook. The dog whined and took another step back. And then he saw it, a hand, pale, motionless, reaching up from beneath the surface. His stomach lurched. His pulse roared in his ears. It was a trick of the light, a branch, a hallucination. But then the fingers moved, curling, uncurling, reaching for him. A strangled sound caught in his throat. And then the hand began to rise. Not floating, not drifting. It was pulling itself up. And Daniel saw something else. The spiral. The same symbol from the dog's collar, branded into the flesh of the hand. His legs finally obeyed. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the dog. And as he did, the hand vanished. The river swallowed it whole, like it had never been there at all. But Daniel knew. It had. And whatever had been in the water, it wasn't done with him yet. Daniel didn't sleep that night. Even after he and the dog made it back to his apartment, his mind refused to let go of what he had seen. The hand, the spiral, the voice. It wasn't possible. He knew that. Knew it in the logical part of his brain, the part that told him he was just overtired, that stress could do strange things to a person. But the other part of him, the part that still woke up some nights gasping for air, haunted by dreams of his mother's lifeless eyes, that part wasn't convinced. The golden retriever hadn't left his side since they got back. It curled up next to him on the couch, tail twitching in restless sleep, as if even in its dreams, something was chasing it. Daniel reached for his phone. 1:13 a.m. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. He could still hear the water in his head, the quiet, lapping sound of the river against the shore. But beneath it, something else, something deeper. A whisper? A breath? A heartbeat? His fingers tightened around the phone. Maybe he just needed proof that none of it was real. Maybe he needed to go back. The town was dead silent at this hour. The streets empty, the houses dark. The only sound was the wind threading through the trees, carrying with it the distant hush of the river. Daniel didn't remember making the decision to drive there. But suddenly, he was standing at the water's edge again. The fog had returned, denser than before, curling around his ankles like a living thing. The dog stood beside him, fur bristling, ears pinned back. Daniel swallowed hard. The river was calm, too calm. But something had changed. Footprints, leading from the river's edge into the woods. They were small, his mother's size. Daniel's lungs constricted. He shouldn't follow them. Every instinct told him to turn back. But his feet were already moving. The dog followed, its low whine the only sound breaking the stillness. The deeper he went into the woods, the stronger the feeling became. A pull, a presence, like something was guiding him, or waiting. Then a sound, a soft, wet dripping. Daniel turned the corner, and his breath caught in his throat. A dress, hanging from a tree, his mother's dress. Torn, soaked, still dripping wet. Daniel staggered back, his vision blurred. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The dog barked, a sharp, panic sound. And then, the dress moved. Not from the wind, from something inside it. Daniel's breath hitched. His body screamed at him to run. And then the whispers began. Not just one voice. Many, too many, echoing through the trees. And they all said the same thing. Come back to the river. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. The whispers surrounded him, curling around his body like invisible hands, pulling at his thoughts, dragging him back. Come back to the river. The dress swayed where it hung from the tree, dripping black water onto the forest floor. The dog barked again. Asterisk, asterisk louder, more frantic. Asterisk, asterisk, but Daniel could barely hear it over the sound of his own breathing. He took a step back, and the forest shifted. The trees moved. Not the way trees should move. Not in the wind, not naturally, but as if the woods were alive. As if they were closing in. The ground beneath him felt wrong. Too soft. Too wet. Daniel looked down, and his stomach lurched. He wasn't standing on leaves. He was standing on bones. Hundreds of them. Human. Some old and splintered, others fresher, too fresh. A cold dread seeped into his veins. He staggered back, but the bones shifted, sinking into the earth like the forest was swallowing them whole. Then, from behind him, a voice. You shouldn't have left. Daniel froze. His skin burned with terror because he knew that voice. Slowly he turned, and there she was, his mother, standing at the edge of the trees, her body still dripping wet with river water, her eyes too dark, too empty. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But she smiled, and then she spoke again. "It's time to come home." Daniel couldn't move. His mother stepped forward, bare feet pressing against the damp ground. Where she walked, the bones disappeared, as if the earth swallowed them whole. The whispers in the trees grew louder, echoing the same words over and over. "Come back to the river. Come back to the river." The golden retriever snarled. It was the first time Daniel had heard it make a sound like that. A deep, guttural warning. Then, without hesitation, the dog lunged straight at his mother. Daniel flinched, but the dog went right through her. She wasn't solid. She wasn't real. And then, her face changed. Her skin peeled away like paper dissolving in water, revealing something underneath. Something wrong. The thing standing before him. It wasn't his mother. It had never been. It was something else. Something that had been waiting for him. The dog whimpered, backing away as the figure twisted and contorted, its bones bending in ways they shouldn't. Then, the spiral. Daniel saw it on her chest, pulsing, twisting alive. And suddenly he remembered the spiral on the guardrail the night his mother died. The spiral on the dog's collar. The spiral on the hand that reached from the river. This wasn't about her. It was about him. The river wanted him. It had always wanted him. Because he had left. Because he had survived. And now, it was calling him back. Daniel's body was numb with terror. He had two choices. Run or fight. And something told him, if he ran, he wouldn't get far. The golden retriever growled again. But this time, it wasn't at the figure in front of them. It was looking at the river. Daniel followed its gaze, and his stomach turned to ice. The water was rising, reaching toward him like liquid hands, curling around his ankles, pulling him in. He fought against it, but the water wasn't just water. It was memories. It was grief. It was everything he had tried to forget. The moment his mother died. The way she had crawled toward the woods, towards something unseen. The way her mouth had opened in a silent scream. And suddenly he understood. She hadn't been running from something. She had been trying to stop something. Trying to stop him from leaving. Trying to warn him. But he had left anyway. And now, the river was fixing that mistake. No. Daniel clenched his fists. He wouldn't let it take him. Not now. Not ever. With all the strength he had, he forced himself backward. The water fought him. The whispers screamed. The thing that had worn his mother's face let out a horrible, ear-splitting shriek. And then, Daniel broke free. He stumbled onto the shore, gasping, soaking wet, though he didn't remember stepping into the water. The retriever barked at the river, hackles raised. Daniel turned and watched as the figure slowly faded, melting back into the water, its last words whispering through the wind. "You can't run forever." Then, silence. The river returned to stillness. And Daniel knew this wasn't over. It would never be over, because the river never forgets. And one day, it would come for him again. Daniel didn't remember how he got home. The last thing he recalled was stumbling away from the river, his clothes soaked, his breath ragged, the golden retriever at his side. The world had blurred around him, his body numb, his mind blank. And yet, somehow, he was here, sitting on his couch, staring at the dog curled up on the floor. It should have been over, but he knew better. The river wasn't done with him. Not yet. The apartment felt different, like something unseen had followed him back. The lights flickered. The air was too still. Even the dog, who had seemed so protective before, was watching him now with something unreadable in its golden eyes. Daniel swallowed hard and reached for his phone. 3:12 a.m. He had been sitting here for hours, but it felt like no time had passed at all. His fingers trembled as he tapped through his photos, desperate for proof that what had happened was real. That it wasn't just some nightmare that had bled into reality. But there was nothing. No pictures from the river. No footprints in the woods. No dress hanging from the trees. His heart pounded. Had he imagined it? Had any of it actually happened? Then, the dog growled. "Low. Warning. Daniel's stomach turned to ice. Slowly, he followed its gaze to the bathroom. The door was cracked open, and from inside, dripping, soft, slow, endless, Daniel's breath hitched. No, he hadn't turned on the faucet. He hadn't even gone in there since coming home. His pulse pounded against his ribs. The golden retriever stood, its body stiff, its ears pinned back. And then, the light in the bathroom flickered. For a second, just a split second, Daniel saw it, saw her, standing in the mirror, her wet, lifeless eyes staring right at him. His mother, or what was left of her. His body locked up in terror. And then, the lights went out. One last message. Daniel couldn't breathe. The darkness was suffocating. The dripping grew louder. The air grew heavier. And then, through the silence, a whisper. You can't run forever. The voice was right next to his ear. Daniel bolted. He slammed on the light switch, his breath ragged, his skin crawling. The room snapped back to normal. The mirror was empty. The bathroom sink was dry. The apartment was silent. But Daniel wasn't fooled. He knew what he had heard. He knew what he had seen. And as he stood there, gasping for breath, his eyes drifted to the golden retriever, and his blood ran cold. Because hanging from the dog's collar, where the spiral had been before, was a single, wet strand of his mother's hair. The river's curse. Daniel didn't sleep that night, or the next, because the whispers didn't stop. The water didn't stop dripping. And the spiral, it was appearing everywhere, scratched into his coffee table, faintly drawn into the condensation on his bathroom mirror, etched into the frost on his car's windshield. And every time he blinked, every time he let his guard down for even a second, he saw her, watching, waiting, because the river had marked him. And one day, no matter how far he ran, it would take him back to where it all began, back to where he was meant to be, drowning in the dark, forever.